So I just want to welcome everyone to this really exciting lecture. I'm Rosanna Hu, Chair of the Architecture Department here. And tonight we are welcoming Manfredi. And I have to tell you that Marion Weiss was the first Penn faculty member I met in person, long before I knew I was coming to Penn. This is many years ago. We had a really nice dinner in an Italian restaurant in New York. And at some point at that dinner, Michael began talking about growing up in Rome. It stayed with me the way certain biographical details do when they suddenly explain an entire body of work. Reading his interviews later, I came across a moment where he describes the Spanish Steps as a magical hybrid invention, part infrastructure, part landscape, part architecture. It is an unusual, yet an unusually precise thing to say about a staircase. It is also almost exactly a way to define most of their projects, I think. And that definition, part infrastructure, part landscape, part architecture, is not about formal hybridity. It is a claim about disciplinary shift. What Manfredi have spent 35 years arguing through their buildings, their research, and their teaching is that the most urgent problems in the contemporary city live at the boundaries between those categories. Architecture that stays safely within its disciplinary boundary quickly loses its relevance. This is a practice that reframes the brief before answering it. The real project is never what the client asks for. It is what the site demands and what the public deserves. That conviction has a history if you look at where they studied. So Marion studied at Yale under James Stirling, a figure for whom diagrammatic clarity and formal surprise were never in opposition, but always in productive tension. Michael studied at Cornell under Colin Rowe, who taught him that architecture is never just about buildings, that it is always entangled with history, politics, and place. And before starting their own practice, both worked under Romualdo Giurgola, a humanist who thought entirely through drawing, for whom the sketch was almost already an argument. And what is remarkable about this lineage is that it's not just prestigious, but it's coherent. It is a lineage that consistently treats architecture as a discipline of relationships rather than just objects and monuments. The evidence is consistent if you look at their projects. At the Olympic Sculpture Park in Seattle, they refused to bury the rail lines and highway. Instead, they folded them into topographic section, the infrastructure X-ray, they call it, exhibiting the city's infrastructure as the choreographic spine of the park. At Brooklyn Botanical Garden, they relocated the visitor center into the street edge and turned the building into a threshold, something you pass through rather than just enter, that slowly dissolves the boundary between city and garden. And then at Hunters Point South, facing a flood-prone waterfront, they proposed what they called creative flooding, treating inundation not as a problem, but as the generative logic of a new urban ecology. And what unites all these projects, rather than a formal language, is really a methodology, a belief that this department holds deeply. Every site is studied, its geological, cultural, and infrastructural history before the design begins. Marion's students here, and I think we met a few today, even from many years ago, who just arrived to visit us today. I think her students will recognize this posture very well. It is exactly how she teaches, rigorously, genuinely open, and never satisfied with the first answer. And I'm sure it's also how Michael teaches at the GST. Writing in the Seattle Times at the opening of the Olympic Sculpture Park, critic John Giovannini observed that Asking Weitzman-Manfredi where they locate themselves in architectural culture, or I would say style, is like asking a chameleon what its real skin looks like. I want to suggest that is precisely the point. In a discipline that's increasingly organized around branded signatures and repeatable formal identities, Weitzman-Manfredi have built their coherence somewhere else entirely, in section rather than elevation, in sequence rather than image, in the careful calibration of how a body moves through space and what it discovers along the way. Giving more relevance, impact, and also significance. Their monograph, Drifting Symmetries, which is also up in the upper gallery on the table, published last year, finally gives this methodology a theoretical frame it deserves. We are fortunate in this department to learn from Marion every day, and tonight we are doubly fortunate to have the both of them here in podium. So please join me in welcoming Marion and Michael.
Rosanna, thank you for such a generous and sort of critical framework to situate our presentation today. I think we're thrilled to be here. I'm especially thrilled to be here because, just to put things in context, when I began teaching at Penn, we had never built anything. We won our first competition here at Penn, and we counted on critics like David Leatherborough along the way to help give us some guidance. And we're thrilled today to be able to share Drifting Symmetries, where we continue to benefit from the conversations, the critiques, the collaborators, the colleagues, the gift from the Dean's Department through Fritz Steiner for some important funding for this book that we'll share, and for collaborators like Rosanna and others who we've benefited from. Weitzman-Manfredi, Architectural Landscape Urbanism, and the purposeful thing there is the absolute confusion between the boundaries between all these disciplines, which have been for us, in a sense, rubrics by which weaving and wandering through and valuing different things, including infrastructure, has, in a sense, been the thesis and generative thing for the work. Michael's going to situate our...
Yeah, I think just another footnote that suddenly, I think, Rosanna, it popped into my head. Romualdo Jurgela taught here at Penn during the kind of moment when Lucan, Venturi were here. So there's a kind of connection that is fundamental in so many different ways and through so many different strands. We'll share 11 projects this evening. Some of them go way back as a way of kind of thinking about the trajectory of our work around 4 themes. And good architecture, as many of you know, can't be reduced to single themes. But I think we've taken those 4 themes as a way of maybe opening up the work to you all in terms of its provocations for us.
So this first image is one that has been a provocation for us for many, many years. That you may know the Nazca lines in Peru. They've been researched, they've been written about, and nobody still fully understands why they were made, why the scale of them were done, and who they imagined that they were for. But the interesting thing is when you think about land art and that sense of operating in a landscape that is not fully yours, even when symmetry comes into focus, something else is at stake that's confusing and enriching that juxtaposition. Call the book Drifting Symmetries because our feeling is so many icons across the centuries have had symmetry at stake, whether it's a church or a major landmark of a building. We've seen symmetry again and again. And yet what we've also seen is that the elements that endure over time are not just static, but they invite movement, they invite change, and they certainly don't operate with the kind of property lines that symmetrical theses do. If we think about these kind of utopian ideals of even larger aggregates, not buildings, but cities, you can also start to think about the kind of medieval city iconic imagery here that you can see a collection of them, and all of them too are bounded and symmetrical, not to let anybody in, indeed surrounded by moats. You can also look at the Villa Plotos here, which is the idea of even a worker colony that's set up to be able to organize itself, and disappear when the work is no longer needed. Again, symmetry. But perhaps more provocative is when symmetry is not so clear, when it takes in forces that are well outside of it, when indeed sometimes it disappears, like the spiral jetty. And it's that drift that for us is the most provocative thing, because ultimately we build architecture, but for us the most interesting work is that which submits to something larger than the terrain it's staked out on. And so that leads to the book Drifting Symmetries. We're so fortunate to have collaborators like Eric Bellin, who was my TA for many, many years, is now teaching and publishing his own books. So he was our editor, Arten Sahakian, who was also a kind of project manager within our office, really making sure that as we built this, we were literally constructing a work that with Pentagram we were able to give form to, because it's as much, I think, maybe even harder to do a book than a building. And yet, the point is that, just to give you a little look through, is that it's organized in a pretty, I would say, layered way, with hybrid projects that have been compelling for us, which we'll talk about in a moment, but also our own work, but conversation, including reflections by people who we admire and engage, including, you can see that Rosanna and Lyndon together actually reflect on things, along with Walter Hood, who we're collaborating with on Lincoln Center right now. So the layering, though, gets into focus. Well, why look back? If we're all about the future and always looking forward, what do we learn from looking back? We've looked at hybrids and enduring models with a different lens. We wondered why some things, in this case 14th century, why some things like Agrasan Kiboli are works of infrastructure, are works of a social setting, disappear if you look on the horizon. You have to discover them from within, and yet they've endured. And this has become, for us in many ways, a question of not just look and be interested, but why not unpack it, document it, rebuild it, literally, so we can understand it in new ways. And so through the research and through this documentation, we took our crushes, if you will, on certain projects, and then pulled them apart like maybe somebody was trying to copy a car for a second, to disassemble it, to reassemble it, to fully understand why it's so compelling. And as we start to think about it, it truly is sectional in the way it operates with water, operates with time, operates with section. And it's the building of these models and forms to fully understand them that lets us understand that they aren't in isolation, but they are also in cities. And we discover them. In the case that we discovered, it was going through a part of the city which has all the hotel laundry, and they're all hung out, so all the streets are lined with white sheets before this comes up and sneaks up on you.
So Rosanna was kind enough to mention growing up in Rome, I remember running up and down these steps, never quite realizing the extraordinary topographic choreography that the architect de Specchi produced. And maybe it was a way of thinking about architecture that you feel through your body. When you move up and down steps, you feel it, the weight. You feel your body shift. And that's, I think, a theme we'll come back to, which is, I think, one of architecture's great gifts, is to understand how your body moves. Whoops. And so you can start to see, we actually took these projects and redrew them all in the context of our office, first starting, I think, in academic situations like here at Penn or at Cornell. Another project that we love and we return to frequently is Gaudi's Parc Güell, where it's hard to describe how it works, what it does, but it's infrastructural. It's an extraordinary piece of architecture. It has a kind of civic function. Very few people know that under the kind of beautiful Belvedere, there is the idea of capturing water in a way that's extraordinarily inventive. It's also a way of dealing with topography. These beautiful walls also are a feat of extraordinary civil engineering. So that sense of everything all at once continues to inspire. Or we had the good fortune to walk through Fujimiko Maki's hillside terrace with Mr. Maki-san, and appreciated the sort of texture and the interplay between solid and void, the sense that you couldn't quite tell where the architecture stopped and where the context in which it was placed began, and vice versa. So we took it upon ourselves to draw, in this image here, the voids, which become just as important as the architectural elements. So that leads us to this sort of theme that recurs, constructing ground, the sense that architecture is all about the ground and how to reframe that ground. And that, I think, was a project in the Brooklyn Botanic Garden where we first started to realize the capacity of architecture to engage its ground plane and its context. So here, the Botanic Garden, a project done probably almost 2 decades ago, we've had the good fortune, we'll share a more recent addition, is a way of mediating between the city and the garden. So we started with a series of very humble origami models to talk about how that building could shift. And then this kind of playful sketch talks about the undulation, the cinematic quality that a project like this might bring. So the building is overtly architectural as it fronts Washington Street in Brooklyn, and then in a way is a building that you can slide through. It's not an object. You can never perceive it in its entirety, which we think is actually an asset. It's about 200 feet long and kind of winds in the sort of sense of the choreography of the garden itself. And that choreography, for example, is exhibited here, where the drip line of this very beautiful, very rare green cherry tree defines the calculus of the roof of the visitor center. And that reciprocity extends to the interior, where you can start to take in the building as a mediator between the city and the garden and learn what all the kind of marvels that the Brooklyn Botanic Garden have to make your trip available and exciting. But it's also a place where, in this kind of oddly two-sided shaped room, this kind of strange leaf shape, we can also start to appreciate the topography of the building because it's nested into an existing berm. So it has this sort of sense of Mobius. You could approach it from two sides, from high and from low, and you can start to see how that kind of sectional relationship is aggregated in that room, which, when the kind of evening starts to kind of unfold, becomes much more of a protagonist as opposed to during the day where it recedes.
Now, one of the points of this building in many ways, as well as 400 feet long, you can never see any part of it all at once. You can only see pieces of it all at once. But it's really, it's its own piece of infrastructure. So it's collecting water, it's actually organizing it so that it can actually nourish the Japanese pond and actually nourish the landscape there by collection geothermal underneath. So in this hard-working infrastructure, it's really unclear at times whether it is indeed architecture or whether it's landscape or really inhabitable topography. And for us, I think the thing that's most exciting is it does indeed become a temporal landscape of sorts that does change. And in fact, different grasses thrive in the season. We had a whole year of experimentation with test plots to see what would thrive, and discovered, oddly, that the north and the south side had to sponsor different plants because of the exposures. But indeed, it's a kind of simultaneity. It's the all-at-once factor of above it's 100% landscape, below it's 100% Olmsted pathways that have carved their way that we've co-opted and grabbed onto. But it's also part of this idea of the 20-foot to 25-foot grade change that we're inhabiting sometimes leaves just a whisper of section that you can see. Now, we were lucky enough to be able to navigate this particular section, but the Botanic Garden wasn't lucky in terms of, let's just say, the ADA concerns that were elevated by the public about a very inaccessible part of the garden that this connected to. And so what you start to see here is that we started to think about the idea of beginning in architecture at the urban edge, but becoming 100% landscape, and maybe through that creating something for this one hillside, which was not navigable and was the entry side from the subway. The recommendation, of course, was the image that you see on the left. Get the ADA thing accomplished in as little square feet as possible. And so we worked with the garden to say, maybe there's something better. Maybe we can help them get a grant to be able to do a beautiful garden, and in this case, a garden that's 1,200 linear feet long that allows us never to have a handrail, but to simply have a sloped walkway with places to pause and rest. And so this was a recent commission that we were brought back to do to correct the work that we were unable to complete. And so this extension, though, became very interesting. Because the timing was critical, we weren't able to do poured-in-place concrete, which was our original thinking. And so we were able to work with a precast company that allowed mass customization of each and every wall that had different demands structurally to be able to go from high to low and embed and capture sloped landscapes that were never too sloped so that they wouldn't fail. It's also incredible sort of thing. If you think about the trees that can thrive, the organization of these trees were to be able to let another garden up north know that the things that could thrive here were not going to be able to thrive that far north. So you're going to see the, incredible sort of landscape here is unique to Brooklyn, and also unique to this garden. I think for us, the most exciting thing was to have the humility of doing something that is not a work of architecture, that is, in a sense, a work of leveraging the topography as part of the garden's narrative.
Coming out. Yeah, very.
And so for us, I think this is the time of year where it really comes alive, but we also like the part where it's absent.
We'll move forward. This is a project very much a work in progress. Hopefully construction will start soon. La Brea tar pits are actually a UNESCO geological site located in the middle of Los Angeles. Many of you know Los Angeles's history is completely intertwined with the development and the discovery of petroleum. So it's this fascinating idea of the very ancient Mesozoic period confronting the city that sees itself only in future terms. So the sense of the kind of the Pleistocene era is an opportunity to tell the story of climate change. The Pleistocene was the last era where intense climate change occurred, and this is actually where active excavations are occurring. So this is a geologic site in the middle of an incredibly sophisticated urban metropolis, and has a museum. So how do we kind of reconcile the museum, a kind of cultural agenda, reconcile the incredibly important need for open space in a city like LA and the importance of ongoing research? So it's a hybrid project unlike any that we've ever had the good fortune to work on. So part of the idea was seeing these different threads as perhaps having a kind of architectural legacy. So part of the idea was not to focus on the architectural itself, which was to expand the museum, but to see how this triple loop could take the museum, move it into the site, into the areas of excavation, and similarly take the areas of excavation and move them into the museum. So you can start to see how this kind of triple loop, which is coincidentally right next to Zumthorpe's also loopy project, up on the screen on the upper left. So these kind of worlds start to collide in interesting and unpredictable ways. The building is again, kind of a typological hybrid. It's both courtyard, where we take an existing building and reframe it, give it shape, start to engage the earth in interesting ways, and then it starts to shift and create space through the formation of a series of landforms. And you could start to see how the building then is alternately coming from the earth or actually pushes itself into the earth. And that kind of ambiguity is something that we find hopefully provocative and part of the kind of narrative of the museum.
This is a view actually walking from the plaza of LACMA, the Zumthor building. And I think one of the really intriguing things is that this is doing many things all at once. It's a geological heritage site. It's the largest urban paleontological active excavation site in the world. It is also a public park, which are very rare in Los Angeles, and it's got a collection that is largely hidden. So if we start to think about putting into focus, you can see a lot of this was making the green put into focus the kind of public terrain and privilege that, but also allow the earthwork of the the thing that contains the collection, to actually stretch and reach out and frame this space so that those loops are seen together. And the other part, though, was it had been buried at one point below grade with storage that you could never see. And so our query is, what would happen if we literally lifted the earth to reveal the collection and then give it an identity and a presence that would be maybe a teaser of the excavation that literally is going on about 600 feet from you. And as it lifts up, there's education programs are really crucial there. This is a place that every school child has known that they've been there at least once if they are a native of LA. And so the heat is terrible there. So the shade equity there is literally part of that gift and passage for an outdoor teaching and amphitheater space. But what you can also see is the clue in, the invitation inside to come into the museum and to discover that it's not just something that you can see from far away, but it's something that you can look up from up close. And this is a case where a lot of this project has been taking the hidden collections and putting them on display, but also, if you can see on the left, bringing into focus a visible lab. And so literally the work that is being done to clean, to categorize, to label is happening there. The other thing that's happening, though, which is super interesting, and this became just public last spring, is they are literally tracking the whole world of climate change through their spores, their pollens, and the dust from leaves. So it's not just the charismatic megafauna, but it's the microfauna. Inside, though, this courtyard will then have a Pleistocene garden that is really trying to bring forward the few things that have survived over time and identify in many ways why these plants have survived, and then obviously a few specimens that didn't survive, that are now extinct. But that idea of putting into focus a sense of prospect, remember, this is a part of LA that is 100% flat. And to be able to literally rise up 24 feet, to have a prospect, and from there be able to see that frieze, which was really the tapestry of that kind of legacy of what was found here, which is why Hancock Park was founded, because of the excavations. The whole idea then is to say these things are stronger because of each other, that the community engagement is really a part of this, that the research is part of it, that the excavation is part of it, but that there literally is a true center now that one can know that we can go here and have 1,000 different routes through that triple loop that Michael mentioned to discover something else. So this sense of discovery, I suppose, for us was an interesting question at the Olympic Sculpture Park in Seattle. Very interesting when you've got a super complicated site divided by train tracks, a highway, contaminated because it was Union Oil of California's transfer facility site, 40-foot grade change, and a trolley barn that was there. So nothing like a museum saying, we'd like to do a sculpture park here. When they came up with the competition, they said they had 3 sites, the waterfront site, the middle site, and the other site, and they wanted to hire some artists to do some bridges to link everything together. Our thought was that that would be entirely wrong. And they said their other version was that they wanted to cover the whole site like Millennium Park did with all that infrastructure to get a lot of land for art. And we said, that's a terrible idea also. So when we entered the competition, we thought, what if it really could be, in fact, a continuous earthwork that could wander from the city to the water's edge and have its own identity made through the very crossing of the infrastructure that they wanted to cover up. You can see the train track going up there, but easier said than done. Michael and I do a lot of these sketches together. A lot of debates are on these drawings, and so you can see some of these debates literally unfolding. We call this the infrastructure X-ray, because the question is, well, this is a federal trucking route down the middle. They wanted to make sure that we were able to preserve salmon habitat if that was at all possible. We had to deal with the contamination of the site with wells and earth and things. We had to manage water. So kind of an impossible thing to do everything all at once. And so the question was, well, what are the systems? How can they layer and reinforce each other? How can they actually start to together make more sense? And with the budget of $35 million, you can imagine that was nothing that made any sense. Our first idea was going to do these incredibly poured in place concrete walls. They exceeded the budget alone for the entire project doubly. So we were lucky enough to work with engineers, in this case MKA civil engineers, who were working on the highway on and off ramps nearby. And they said, you know, if we could just use MSE, mechanically stabilized earth, it's really cheap. If we do that, and then we've got some precasters who are terrific up in Canada, but they said, you know, we got this whole seismic thing going on. So we said, well, why not actually do these precast walls that would fit on the flatbed trucks, overlap each other, so when there's a seismic event, they'd move, but they wouldn't fall apart. And so that's what you see here. The other thing was that, again, we ran out of money and fill was expensive. But we were so lucky that they were excavating downtown. And so we got 200,000 cubic yards of earth for free, which enabled us to be able to encapsulate all the contaminated soil and also give us a topography then that would address this topographically now invented site because of these crossings. And so in that kind of status, we were able to think about giving Richard Serra his due, and you can see his piece Wake Within a Valley. And indeed, that we loved working with Richard Serra, but we have such phenomenal envy because we would never be able to say we'd like the foundation to be 15 feet bigger in every direction because we might change our mind when the cranes arrive. I don't even want to tell you what that did to our budget. So, but the point that was really interesting was that he was very, very precise, and indeed he landed it right where he thought he would. But what he did, though, was he created a place of change. And the sculpture park was what the Seattle Art Museum wanted to have, was an invitation for no walls, free and welcome to everybody to experience art and see it change over time. And that change is one where literally, if the site unfolds and the building unfolds at the same time, the thesis of architecture and site are made together. And made together so that the interior itself is all about looking to the outside. The outside is all about new natures and invented natures being creative that are native. And that native community that we know of as Seattle, which has Hemp Fest of all things, has a chance to be able to celebrate those and other things within the amphitheater. But indeed, it's called the Olympic Sculpture Park because of the mountains beyond. And so you can see Calder Eagle, if any of you know a film here, Rocky. I think this used to belong in Philadelphia, but made its way all the way to Seattle to mark their horizon.
So all those people gathered in front of the building were for yoga, and we thought, oh, fantastic, they must be loving the architecture, but they also were getting ready for Hemp Fest. So we're happy to think that this project could host Hemp Fest in new and beautiful ways. But again, the idea of the tactility of drawings, we also do very sophisticated animations, but drawings are a way in which we can communicate both to Marion and myself, but also to our collaborators. And again, I want to emphasize all of these projects are the fruit of intense collaborations. But the sense that you could slide over the highway without the kind of overt ego of a bravura bridge and make that kind of a little subtler proved to be interesting because we've since gone back and everybody loves to take selfies at this incredibly precise corner which sits over the highway, which has been captured by Iwan Ban in this beautiful photo. So the sense of the museum being part of the city, we love the idea that you could drive by without any interest in what this weird red thing is and somehow say that you visited a museum and you could see art. And similarly, this was a kind of notation that Richard Serra brought to our attention, which is the beauty of trains sliding through the park. Why hide them? It becomes kinetic sculpture of the highest quality. We were also privileged to work with a number of artists. This is a piece, Seattle Cloud cover by Teresita Fernandez, which was her first public piece. So the idea of moving across the train tracks and seeing the quality of light change was a kind of great gift that she brought to this project. But I think the thing that we're most proud of is a thing that paradoxically you can't see, which is the idea of bringing salmon habitat back. This project was interesting because it allowed Seattle to kind of reclaim its waterfront. So it was a hybrid client between the Olympic Sculpture Park and the Seattle Art Museum and the city of Seattle. So this is the first stretch of waterfront, and if some of you have gone back to Seattle, you'll see that they are now believing in the ability of architecture to reconnect to the waterfront, the ability of landscape to reconnect to the waterfront, and the ability of civil engineering to reconnect. And in this case, the ability to engineer, this beach is completely engineered, completely artificial. It looks natural, but it's been highly engineered with a series of hydraulic specialists. And we were the beneficiaries of a big storm that brought this amazing kind of collection of driftwood. And that driftwood also signals, I think, the restoration of salmon habitat. So you could say that the park itself either begins in the water in this beautiful subaqueous condition or ends there. And we love the sense of that kind of confusion about whether the park is part of the water or part of the city. And you'll see that in this film by Michael Seldish, a friend and filmmaker. And the sound is particularly important because I think in architecture we forget how important sound is. You can hear the gravel change. It's very intentional, the sense of bringing back kind of haptic world. She's so cute. She was, it was just so lucky to see her there. We were talking earlier, we live in an incredibly visual world, highly digitized, and I think, again, architecture's capacity to remind us of the kind of other senses, sound, touch, smell. And that brings us to a very small project, our only house. So if there's someone in the audience who has a house for us to design, we were ready. But this is the McCann residence in Tuxedo Park, a very beautiful area north of New York City. The house, in a way, is an homage to the beautiful stone retaining walls that were built by Italian immigrants in the 1880s. So the house is a kind of layered sequence of terraces that also slow down the water. So there's a kind of ecological agenda to it, I suppose. And our clients loved the topography. This was a house that could not be built now because of the sort of intense topography, but the sense that you literally climb a hill or descend a hill if you're going to get coffee or going to bed was something that our clients really loved, and we were able to embrace that. But it's also a kind of site that is mysterious and beautiful in the early morning, kind of around the mist. You can see this construction site. It happens to kind of be, first and foremost, a way of engaging the topography. So literally many of these rocks were quarried within half a mile. So it has the kind of the earth quite literally. And then we were adding some additional rocks that came literally from this site as we built up the kind of topography.
The amazing thing about this particular site was, as Michael mentioned, it was unbuildable. The only reason we were allowed to build on it was that there was something that looked like a Pocono ski lodge that had been there. It had a hot tub with a big central atrium around that. It was ready to go. And so we were lucky that we could actually use some of the foundations to be able to build on this site. The interesting thing, though, was it was, of course, an object more or less on stilts. We were able to now literally, as Michael said, think about these almost like a series of check dams. And as we thought about that grade change, we also thought about a relaxed kind of itinerary for our clients to be able to make their way up and slalom through this site. And as they did so, the tactility of the stones are complemented again by the tactility in this case and the light catching properties of these bronze paneled shutters. When they're away during the week, these are shut, and when they're there on the weekend, they're open. But what that does is it allows that sense of weathering to not just take its shape in the form of the older ancient rocks that were there, but also in a contemporary material that will age. It's interesting that this particular kind of site continues to go all the way up. It's a glacial split and an outcropping, and so we sort of had to squeeze our way in there. There was no way to even have a flat level anywhere as we wanted to reach into that. So we tapered the landscape and even tiered it, and even within the house had a series of levels just to be able to navigate that topography. What becomes interesting, though, is that the idea of it landing in the site here now is that for a certain moment, when you're up here, you really just think that this is simply a 1,200 square foot home. And it's a 1,200 square foot home that overlooks the lake, that has the kind of wild strawberries that are growing in and starting to take over the slope. But it's also a place that seems pretty magical as well, because the formidable kind of, if you will, check dam language that comes from the road is completely now translated into something altogether different. So it's this kind of translating into altogether different, which touches on connections. Will Michael introduce?
So again, these kind of themes are somewhat porous, so you'll have to forgive us for kind of framing them in ways around projects, but they do, I think, remind ourselves of the capacity of architecture to create connections. I think it's one of its great gifts. And particularly now that we have had the luxury of seeing buildings inhabited over a period of time, that provocation is even more urgent. So we created a series of kind of digital models that we continue to talk about in terms of how you could kind of choreograph movement up, through, around, and in a building, and then kind of took the opportunity to abstract that and think about that. And this has become a way in which we also work, where the kind of thread of circulation becomes the kind of identifier or the kind of DNA of a project. And that DNA will be, we hope, evident here. And we've had the very good fortune to work with Eduardo Glant, an engineer, Dean here, who I think opened our eyes to the capacity of this project to be a generous neighbor in what at the time was a pretty bleak part of campus. As many of you know, it's west of here, but awfully important because it's a kind of a transition zone between the city and the campus itself. So this liminal area becomes an opportunity to think about the building as more than just an opportunity to house nanotechnological research. So lots of little study models that allowed us to think about how the building could make a courtyard, how you could move up and through this courtyard, how the kind of form of the building might be both embracing but also defining the street. So the idea of taking that courtyard and twisting it and turning it up so that it's alternately a courtyard building, but it's an open-ended courtyard building. And then that final cantilever allows us to define the street. So it has a kind of urban agenda. And these multiple layers start to track themselves through the building. And we'll use this as an opportunity to kind of cite, in this case, this was Severed Engineering, which we want to show this because in some ways, we love the sense that the provocation of working with extraordinary consultants allows us to rethink certain things. So the idea of the cantilever then allowed us to think about the form and the expression of the skin of the building. Similarly, the horizontal cantilever, which you see, which absorbs lateral loads, allowed us then to think about the shape of some of the interior spaces. So you can start to see how you could slide into the building, and then find yourself in what we're thinking of, again, this kind of liminal idea between the hard research, the introverted research of the building, and the kind of expression of the generosity of Penn's courtyard spaces and the idea of translating them into this kind of interesting hybrid project, where this becomes, in a way, a sort of a porch building.
As we think about this, though, it has obviously an amber kind of cast here that you can see publicly. The whole point of this amber glass was to say that when we first looked at clean rooms, they were all walled off. There would be a little orange portal, and that was there to keep a certain kind of UV light from interrupting the work that was happening in the lab. We said, Could we just do that everywhere? Well, they'd never done it before, but they tested and they found it wasn't going to undermine the actual work. And so that amber glass is something that you are seeing typically now on the inside. But what they were very excited about was that often, these things have safety issues. So to be able to see and be seen is actually a real virtue when people are in their bunny suits, and the kind of focus work and light needs that benefit of change of light. It's also very interesting, though, to think that this is the research at the smallest possible element that is really changing our world, but it's also a place that's introducing a whole pipeline of people who are curious enough to begin to imagine themselves as scientists in the building. And Penn's very generous of hosting them. But as we start to think about this kind of experience indoors, we can also start to think about what is it like to be in a lab building. Lab buildings are weird in that they've got 20 feet floor to floor. None of this kind of, easy to climb a set of stairs. And so when you start to think about this stair, the question was, since elevators had to be in the remote quarters to avoid vibration and EMI interference, the question was, how could this become an irresistible place to collaborate as well? And so the stair has, of course, all the things that you would want to have, which is the ability to get from one place to the other, but places to pause and collaborate. Because microscopy characterization need very little vibration or want very little vibration, basements are valuable rather than the way we think about them here. And so drawing light into that microscopy characterization suite meant that while it was in the basement, we pulled the land down to draw light into it. But one of the most important things is that people working in labs are typically in these double-loaded corridors, not talking to each other, not literally seeing where their colleagues are working and where collaboration happens. So the kind of unfolding that you see that happened in a very small planimetric section was all about making these sight lines at either end to be something where you could see what's happening, even in these conference rooms, which are acoustically isolated but visually connected. The very top room, the Glant Forum, was a very interesting one because here you could actually have intimate forums, but be extroverted in the urban landscape. And while it's an intimate room, it's elevated and offers sights back to the campus and to the city. And is one where that kind of unfolding signature starts to give away that sense of what's happening with the actual surface itself. The surface itself is looking at glass in a very interesting way with an externally acid etch pattern, which is helping to control the kind of heat gain, but it's also playing different games in terms of the way it behaves. And as you start to see the engagement of both reflection and a kind of choreography, working with our consultant, Heinches, and working and being able to go to the factories and see what they're doing with the fabrication meant that this was something that could be tuned while we were designing it. But it's also, in many ways, the kind of both and, valuing the kind of stability of the earth and valuing the kind of aerial kind of expression that you could have in a city and in the campus. And so what you can start to see in this film, again by Michael Seldich, is that the piece we lost, somebody like Eduardo Galante is passionate about art. As dean, he made sure there was as much art as there was science on display. Again, the whole point of being able to see this building come alive at night. For us, it's wonderful that so much of the research that happens at Penn is indeed hidden, and now you can see it. So again, I would say tonight that you might very well see that view.
So we'll move from Philadelphia to Toronto. And this is a recently completed project, kind of interesting to go back. But if some of you know, Toronto is at the intersection of university and college, right next to the Legislative Assembly of Ontario. So it's a kind of a hinge site, a lot like Penn, between the campus and the city, and a very, very important site, kind of from a historic point of view. So it was very important for us to think of the building not just as a kind of lab building. University of Toronto's been instrumental in developing through Professor Hinton the early ideas around AI. So this is essentially a dry lab building for computation. But it was also, I think, we worked very hard to kind of think of it as a building that would open up to its context. Often that kind of research is completely introverted. But we also love the sense that Toronto has what some would call a very aggressive winter. But for us and for many Torontonians, that winter has a very magical kind of light. And you can start to see that in the interplay between the surface of the building and the snow-covered park and street, and that sense of this sort of soft light, which tends to kind of dematerialize the architecture. And then, of course, during the summer, the kind of precast facades play with the kind of orientation of this building so that as the sun moves, certain parts cast shadows. And that was something that was very important to us. Light's precious in Toronto, as it is, I think, everywhere. And it's a very peculiar light. So you need to kind of push the articulation to capture that light. And for, again, think of architecture as a metering device that gives us the pleasure of understanding how the sun moves. We also worked very closely with sort of a series of Canadian precasters, so the sand and the stone comes from the lake beds nearby, has a sense of being incredibly local. And we'll sort of share this because this is an institution that prizes making things here at Penn, and that kind of exploration extended in our professional world to how the precast could be cast, the scale of the pieces such that they could be easily shipped. We don't think of how things not only are made, but how they could be moved and erected.
So if we had to give a lot of attention to this external kind of fortified expression in part, we had to tilt back because we couldn't have any new shadows on the legislature lawn. And so literally that tilt to keep all our floors was to be able to get 2 additional floors in the building. But when you start to think about these additional floors, it's a vertical campus. This is just Weitzman Innovation Campus, and vertical campuses tend to not work. So one of our biggest questions was, well, how can we actually create a kind of terrain where there is a connective tissue and the areas outside the labs and the research areas could become a collaborative environment? And from those, you could start to see where you were in this urban context. So that dialing between begins very much at the urban level. And you can start to see that here we did a very tricky thing, and that we made 2 floors out of 1 because there was an obligation to be able to have a certain height on the ground floor. But we made that the introduction to the collaborative mezzanine. And from that, we then chopped up another floor above us to be able to to accommodate a convening space, which we thought was impossible to be able to achieve in the building. But by literally doing this kind of funny bumping around, we were able to get some free square feet. But this convening space really is a wonderful room to be in. And yet right next to it is a fire stair that actually has an ability to connect itself and connect your views back to the legislator grounds. This stair then, the signature zipper up the building, is one that leads you to really pretty tough labs. I mean, these are very simple, they're reconfigurable, and they're refit out by whoever the scientist and whoever has got the grant to be able to take it forward. And again, at the counterpoint to each one of these labs, there is an access either above or below to these winter gardens. And these winter gardens then with their terraces are establishing that kind of relationship with the city, with the campus, with its hinge location, literally and figuratively, and with its aerial sort of expression, if you will, of that staircase that leads up to the uppermost winter garden. The other datum really is truly that of the city itself. And so we worked with Heritage to make sure that our datums and these public spaces were in concert with each other in an area that cares deeply about those relationships.
So we're moving along, literally, lines of movement. Again, capturing both the fluidity of the temporal world, but also how people move through space in that sense. So we love the kind of Piranesian idea paired with the highway outside of LA. So as we're kind of reaching a bit of a conclusion, we'll sort of dwell a little bit on Hunter's Point, which, as Rosanna had mentioned, is a kind of highly a site that has seen many multiple histories. It was actually a wetland that allowed for flooding in very productive ways. It was an industrial powerhouse for New York City. And then went fallow in the 60s, and now I think about 5 or 10 years ago, from 10 years to 5 years, became a part of the urban fabric. It's also the setting for the largest affordable housing since 1970. So there's a kind of a housing agenda that is become, as you all know, increasingly critical. So here's the waterfront. It has a playful edge that we decided was critical, but it was also an edge that we thought could be reconceived of. And we weren't the only ones to be thinking about this. There were a number of scientists who had been thinking quite a bit about how flooding might be impacted and how we might think of a water's edge as perhaps a little more porous, and rather than pushing with concrete walls, which was the dogma in the 50s and 60s, how might we let water in productive ways? So what you're seeing here is a kind of a playing field that has a cistern that can capture a couple 100,000 cubic gallons of water. And here you see it. And when Hurricane Sandy came by, this area was completely flooded. We were able to detain the water and then slowly release it with very little damage. So it was something that was, I think, a hair-raising moment where we were hoping that we and our engineers were in fact right, and thankfully we were. But I think this goes back to the idea that the gift of architecture is also a way in which the unpredictability of nature can be given a certain level of resonance and a certain ability to celebrate that sense of unpredictability rather than fight it. So rather than 4 different structures, which the Parks Department wanted, we consolidated them into a bathroom, an office, a cafe, and a water taxi area that is captured, all 3, 4 of those different elements, by this pleated roof. And the pleating allows for a certain level of structural stability, but it also allowed us to capture water and sunlight. So this is a net zero park. And we love the sense that this was actually fabricated by a company that does a lot of marine structures. So there's a kind of symbolic sort of connection to the city. And that connection also allowed us, working with Tom Balsley, SWA, to kind of reclaim some of the landscapes that were part of this site, these kind of beautiful Ragusa roses and shore pines.
Some of you might have remembered, if you were really old, Water Taxi Beach that used to be here. Let's just say less family focused at that time. But if we look at the possibility, though, of the prospect of this park, certainly being on the other side of the water is the best way to see Manhattan. And yet, as we thought about it, part of it was actually organizing, as Michael said, the 4 structures that we were asked to build by Parks into one that could unfurl and open and focus on really the most extraordinary views that you could imagine. Again, you can see the water taxi stop there, the shade that offers, is one that really becomes a kind of liminal place of transition. And certainly the city becomes then the theater at night beyond. And as we were just finishing construction of this, we were told that they didn't have the money for the second part of the project, which we had designed all the way through the early schematic design phase. We had to re-interview competitively to complete the project. We were very grateful that we were selected because this was what was left over, kind of this beautiful legacy of topography that remained there, the last little bit of the kind of where the docks had been. And we thought that this was the most magical moment because unlike most of the flat parks that you see around the waterfront, this one had topography. And so we wondered, what would it be like to almost be in a ship where you're actually looking out, and what would it be like to be on the other end as if you're walking in water, on water? And so we were very inspired by the shipbuilding that used to happen around this area, and started to do these charcoal drawings and collages to give measure to what this could be, to have this sense of prospect and infrastructure, a new kind of infrastructure, and then still have a kind of an aquatic flood control infrastructure that you could inhabit. So working with shipbuilders in Maine, we were able to actually create that little structural twist and turn. Arup worked with us. They were really struggling with not the bend and the turn, but actually the overturning capacity, but they worked it out. But the point was that it was really the tension between holding back the earth and actually creating a fortification. You saw the medieval fortified thing that I shared at the very beginning, letting that fortification become a place that at the very top of you could walk on water. And so you can start to see how the flooding is controlled and managed, and then indeed nourishes a new set of wetlands. We added a whole acre of wetlands to the site. And then also where a piece of the site had just not quite fully been able to be adhered to it, removed some of that land so that this could become literally a bridge to an island. We like to say it's the first island that's been in New York for some time that was invented. But that island is one that has a great prospect in its own way, and yet it's literally the kind of prospect of this overlook pier that is the place of magic above. It's also a place of magic below. And that sense of everything all at once, infrastructure, park, destination, is it architecture? We don't know. But it is indeed something that has movement at place. The school's directly opposite it. And so, again, that sense of movement with the ferry, the sense of being there for the community that was being invented as we spoke. Michael mentioned largest affordable housing that has happened since the 70s. But trying to bring this kind of sense of new nature and timeless nature that had been eradicated with the industrial origins, but now returned into something that could become a public destination. So it raises questions about what are the surfaces of things? If the surfaces are the things that we touch, we see, we feel, or we have impressions of, it finally gets to this question of surface presence. And for us, you could say surface presence sometimes disappears, but the tactility, in this case of glass at the Sci Center for Innovative Thinking at Yale, was one where we were given the opportunity to build the tiniest building that they've ever commissioned at Yale, as far as we know. But it also one in a weird site. They say, could you do an addition to either the building that you could see just directly behind Dunham Lab, or could you addition to Breuer's Becton lab building there? Well, we said, look, you can't even see it. Let's think about something that we could actually see, like Magritte's light bulb, if you will, as an idea, because indeed, this was the site, and they wanted us to add to the building on your right or left, and we said both answers seemed wrong. This is the roof of a lab building right here. So we said, what if we actually created something a little bit more like a Tempietto that was an island there that could be reached below, that connected all the other labs together, but could be its own identity. It did take not adding to Breuer, but taking away some of Breuer to be able to achieve this. And our thought was, that's me actually standing in front of the wall saying, can we really take it down? And indeed, we took it down to create a new landscape. And this new landscape was literally creating a kind of prospect now for this place that is literally supposed to be the kind of transparent hinge of collaboration in the engineering part of the campus.
So because this is sitting over habitable space, research space had to be very light structure. So the kind of foundations were actually a matte foundation. They literally float on top of the existing roof, including the roof beams, which you can start to see are extremely light. We introduced a little kind of a terrace balcony area for more intense and private conference rooms. But the project's lined with a series of pleated or curved glass panels, 21 feet high, and they're self-supporting. You know, if you take a piece of paper and just bend it a little bit, it supports itself. So that's a very simple and very old technique was employed with glass. The glass was fabricated in China, shipped to New Haven. And what we loved was the kind of interplay between the existing buildings and this new building. So it does literally become a bit of a chameleon. But it also allows for a free span. So the glass, as I mentioned, is self-supporting. There are thin columns that support the roof loads themselves, the kind of green roof that is giving it a sort of a crown. And the interplay then of natural light in a large area for convening and for different conferences is also offset by this giant saffron curtain, which when drawn turns what is a very outward looking building into a kind of cocoon. So the ability to manipulate surfaces to create different effects and accommodate different programs was something that we were quite intrigued with. And you can start to see how the elevation of smaller, more intimate areas allow for different views through the building into its context. And that kind of context then becomes the protagonist in a way. It shapes the facade of this building in ways that at times are predictable and times unpredictable. And then at night, of course, what is an extremely transparent building becomes, as I mentioned, a kind of cocoon. So I'll quickly go through Kent State, because I know we're a little tight for time, but use Kent State as a way of talking not only about some of the themes, but also this idea of the interplay of light and section. Kent State is an area that's has kind of lost a lot of manufacturing, but we were very intrigued with the kind of historic, simple factory buildings. So it's a college of environmental design that has everything from construction to architecture to project management. And it is essentially a loft building that's tipped a lot like the GSD, but unlike the GSD, the trays are very broad. And that sort of sense of tipping and creating an internal topography, a kind of either a tripartite or a continuous loft, was something that allowed the directors of the program to reinvent different groupings and different programs each year. So that level of flexibility became important. So the section then becomes the facade. It's telescoped onto the facade, which faces north. The building, we shifted it slightly so that we can get raking morning light and morning afternoon light, because often, as you know, north-facing buildings don't have the gift of the light hitting them in ways that provide a level of generosity. It's also a building seen on the oblique, so the idea of pulling these bays out allowed for views up and down, and it is, in a way, is a transitional building between the campus and the city. So at times it nests itself next to a series of older houses, and at times, as you can start to see, it kind of captures the light in a kind of more evocative way. So the trajectory up through the building has its own kind of internal topography. This was as it was set up on the first day, but joyfully it quickly disintegrated into creative chaos.
That kind of creative chaos we were very grateful for. We were really nervous when we saw it set up the way it was first set up. And thankfully, it keeps on being reconfigured. But indeed, they actually have a materials library, not just a library with books, but materials. And so we were able to create this, both a regular library and a materials library that actually took into focus the funders for it, which was Belden. And Belden does amazing bricks. And you can start to see here, this was the idea of collaborating with the materials that were nearby, but indeed working with Belden Brick to have them resurrect a beehive kiln, which they no longer used because they couldn't get predictable color constancy in the bricks themselves. And we said, we actually thought that was great. You know, we liked a little bit of variation. And so we also work with them to come up with a custom brick, and in this case, a brick that could extend out 4 inches, and it was as far out as we could come before we had to pay for a relieving angle. So this is literally about as far as you can go. But what was exciting about this, you know, creating this new form, was recognizing that this form is a surface on a School of Architecture's building that people who maybe don't know about architecture are interested in touching. And that form is one, and that bricks are things that could also sometimes slide by and offer a level of transparency. Or in the middle of winter, when frankly, the only building that's illuminated at midnight, that the architecture school could actually have a presence that was inviting and revealed the kind of collaborative terracing that's above. And that collaborative terracing is really what we're so interested in, which is how do you convene, how do you touch, how do you feel, and how do you bring down a community maybe that had never been invited in before. Just do a tiny cameo here because groundbreaking's coming up at Lincoln Center. This is their performing arts new park, and in many ways, some of you may not even know that Lincoln Center has an outdoor theater. This is the Guggenheim Bandshell. The audience stretches back about 180 feet from there, and they have to put up a temporary stage every summer because it doesn't work. So we started to think about the fact that this was an object, and again, we don't like objects, we like places. So we started to think about how maybe the band shell itself could reach around and create an environment. And maybe we could actually take the paradigm of front to back for performer to audience and try to create something half the distance so that the same number of people could be brought closer. And then we wondered what would happen if we could actually add some shade to the kind of tiered seating that's around that and carry that ribbon forward into an embracing plaza. And in this case, a little bit inspired by Campidoglio, we'll admit, creating a plaza that would become a year-round destination even when the theater is not in play. And that idea of that peak is no longer a peak of the Guggenheim bandshell you see here in this section, but indeed a ribbon that rises and falls with the kinds of sounds of performance and the gatherings inside.
So we'll just show very quick, this was just created. So the idea that you would see this building and its silhouette change depending on your orientation. I should mention it's part of a project that we're working very closely with Walter Hood on. So it has an incredible social agenda where the theater turns now, which it had turned its back to a rather disenfranchised community. The theater now turns back toward the community. So there's an incredible urban and social agenda to this, in effect, invitation. The architecture becomes an invitation into Lincoln Center.
And that invitation into Lincoln Center, if you've gone to Lincoln Center, you probably don't know anything about this park. And so we hope that just this little oblique view will give you a clue on that oblique orientation that there's performances about to happen, or there's a sense that there's a place that has never existed outdoors. All performances are free and open to the public, but that it is as much a theater as those behind the boxes. And so we'll close with the idea of the unboxing, if you will, the very thing that needs unboxing. This is Longwood reimagined. And if any of you have been to Longwood, you know that it's a legacy of Pierre Dupont and his passion for collecting gardens. And you could say that on this estate that you can see here, on the far right-hand, upper right-hand side, you could see the creation of these amazing conservatories, basically buildings 100 years ago with glass roofs. And then everything on the lower part there was where they produced everything for those conservatories. So that was all the back of house on the other side, all the production houses. And you'll notice that they're 100% transparent. All of this exists on a ridge, and a ridge line that's defined it. And so we started to think about it as a crystalline ridge. And you can start to see here that the kind of wandering lines of the Brandywine Valley and the crystalline kinds of peaks that we saw on all the production greenhouses became something that we wondered about, something that was 100% transparent, not unlike their production greenhouses, but in this case, here to celebrate an invitation that's every bit as compelling as the historic conservatories. You start to look at this kind of structure, this ensemble, working with Reed Hildebrand on these kind of gathering up this larger landscape. The question became, how could we actually bring landscape into the creation of this new conservatory? We loved the allays of trees and the shaping of spaces that they offered, and we started to look at the possibility of the supporting branches of this actually behaving like the groves of the sycamores nearby, and actually look at these peaks as something that could begin to actually give shape and dimension rather than a monolithic roof. And you'll see many, conservatories today are all about these huge spheres with no columns, and we wanted the columns to actually participate. And in the creation of this garden here, saying this garden under glass is a terrain that is to be experienced, in this case, with a Mediterranean climate, no matter what the climate is. It's pleated in such a way that it's gathering water that keeps the irrigation going, but it's a hard-working infrastructure. It's got earth tubes that are over 100 feet long that stabilizes the temperature at 55 degrees all the time from the earth, so you're either heating it up a little bit or cooling it down a little bit. It's also gathering water. It has a geothermal system. It is literally a 32,000 square foot living, breathing building with an operable roof and 100% operable walls. So as you start to look at this, you can start to see the legacy here of the water collection tanks, the earth tubes feeding their way in there. But the idea that we have is that sometimes you never want everybody to know about that, because ultimately when you arrive, it's really on this mirror-like setting that makes you see that the magic of the garden is the first and foremost obligation of Longwood, which is to make people curious and wonder. And so as sort of crisp as you could see this articulated set of folds, what we love is when it reaches the side that kind of, that strand, if we thought of the topography, is one that's reenacted again here with a slow dip in the building that comes down as close to the ground as 10 feet and then rises up to 35.
So you can also see the kind of roof has a topography which in a way celebrates the beautiful Brandywine Valley. And again, I think a big nod to our landscape collaborators, Reed Hildebrand. But the building itself, as Marion said, is always moving. It's in motion. There's a sensor that allows you to test the weather and start to see how that sort of interplay between the movable aspects of the building, the fluid condition of the ground plane, and the play of light all start to collaborate and, in a way, think of this building as a chameleon. So you can start to see that the roof shutters and allows for passive ventilation, and we also can capture the breezes that move laterally so that the building consumes as little energy as possible. But we also love the sense that as the light moves across the building and it's kind of aqueous ground plane, that light reflects into the conservatory. So at the sort of end of the day, you get this incredible play of light. And similarly at night, this kind of ginkgo LA, which will be absolutely resplendent in the fall, offers a different kind of structure, a different kind of interplay, so that both new and old, mineral and vegetal, can start to talk to each other. So here's the building as you kind of approach it. All of this water is captured and reused for irrigation, so it's very, very, I think every square foot of the roof is, in a way, a water collector that then works its way in and allows us to kind of reclaim the capacity and the wonder of water, which is, as we all know, an incredibly precious resource. Many of the plantings actually live in more dry climates, so there's also a lesson about horticulture and where it might be in the next 20 years. But we're reminded of Alvaro Siza's quote, which had less to do, and I'll paraphrase it, with trying to be original, but architecture should be about transforming reality. Thank you.
Thank you for that very delightful and just amazing lecture. Now, we will take some questions, maybe I would say 5 or 6, and Michelle has microphones. There's one up here.
Thank you for the amazing lecture. I'm particularly inspired by how you work in terms of formulating the landscape. But what I discovered when you showcase all of your various projects is that you create all of these various amazing structural, almost skeletons, which is almost like a silhouette or traces how you formulate your architecture through the landscape. Can you tell us a little bit more about your collaboration process with your structural engineers and how your processes? Do you intend to create a certain structure of it, or does the structure help you to inform what landscapes or what landforms that you're ultimately going to get? Thank you.
You've asked a great question because we've been really lucky to have wonderful structural engineers as collaborators. And often what we do is we delay structure and then we draw it as suggestively as possible and then freak them out to figure out how light it can be. The first engineer we worked with on the nanotechnology building added at the end of design development a column under the cantilever. So we had to move forward with another engineer who was able to take the column away. And in the case of working with Jay Taylor on these, it really was the question of how could we get these fabricated in Germany and shipped and installed here and erected literally almost like a barn raising, so that part of the issue is not even just the structure and the work it did, but how it got here and how it made its way up without acquiring any kind of new bending moments.
Yeah, I would just add a couple things. things. Unfortunately, this particular project and this image features structure as a skeletal. It's a hybrid skeleton. It's actually a series of moment frames. So it's not a pure structural expression, which of course makes it interesting. But what you don't see is the kind of, on the other projects, the bravura of moving Earth, which has its own dynamics and its own fluidity, and that has a different engineering agenda too. So sometimes the Earth is a more significant structural protagonist, like in the Olympic Sculpture Park, and here, of course, the skeleton and the framework is the protagonist.
Thanks, Marion and Michael. That was wonderful. I'm thinking about the Brooklyn Botanical Garden entrance, which I live 10 blocks away from that. And then I've had the pleasure of going running along the Olympic Sculpture Park and Garden a couple of times in Seattle. And having worked with landscape architects, there's a careful balance, of course, between how much architecture you need to allow, or maybe how much architecture you should withhold to allow for the landscape to eventually grow in, right? And how that interplay works. And I'm just curious, thinking about Brooklyn and obviously maybe the Women's Memorial down in DC, how your design has changed as you've probably learned more from watching landscape grow into your projects over time. I'm just curious if you could comment on how that has evolved.
Sure. Well, I think the Olympic Sculpture Park, we never thought about, is it architecture as landscape? We just did a project. It was a competition. We said landforms. Later then, of course, you battle with who's got this agenda, who has that agenda. On the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, we were extremely fortunate, and we do have landscape architects in our office. At that time, it was Michael Steiner, who's since gone on to do a very beautiful work on his own. In that case, the Botanic Garden, because they were all about horticulture and landscape, were our primary landscape architects in a certain sense as clients. The Overlook was an opportunity to work with Toby Wolf, who unfortunately has passed away, who had an incredible knowledge of how plants, particularly the ground covers, would be animated seasonally. So his great gift for us was to position walls in such a way that if you brushed up against rosemary, you could smell it. And that was a kind of, again, a gift that typically we don't think about in terms of architecture, activating all the senses. So that was in a way, a great moment of collaboration that still sticks with us.
Yeah, I think that the other thing that we've learned is that a building can look its very best the day you open it, and that's why you photograph the hell out of it that minute before anybody shows up. Landscape takes a while, and our very first project was the Olympia Fields Park in Chicago, and we asked the landscape architect we were working with, we're thinking about when we're going to photograph it, try to get it published, and we said, when do you think it's going to look good? And we were thinking April, May, June, and he said, you could probably get a few photographs in 5 years, but I'd really wait 10. And I think that that was for us one of the most humbling things, is to think about time in a very different way, and that's what we've learned the most about working with landscape.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was really great to see your projects and actually hear you break it down. I've used a lot of your projects for studio precedents, so it was cool to hear your explanations. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on artificial intelligence as a firm operating at one of the higher levels of architecture. I know there's a lot of buzz around it right now with a lot of other industries. So as architects who are working at such a high level of operation, how is artificial intelligence and technology changing how you interact with clients and develop your projects?
That's a great question, because I think technology is now something that we're leveraging in ways that we never thought, including AI, for instance, when we're trying to get some motion showing up in a rendering that we're trying to say has life in it. But I think the architectural intelligence is embedded in so many different layers. What we don't ever see is literally on the Lincoln Center project, there are 110 people on our collective team who are stakeholders in different ways and offering different elements. And then there's 97 people in the client group. And so when we start to think about intelligence, part of it is technology, and intelligence is figuring out streams of decision making. And so as odd as it sounds, that's probably one of the most intriguing things that we're looking at in terms of intelligence, is ensuring that decisions and checkpoints can enable momentum and finally realization, to not get so burdened by time that cost grows and then you can no longer realize the work. So these are strange ways in which we're learning about technology and the agency of architecture.
I would also add, and we are, like you guys, testing the waters and trying to see what works for us. But I think the one thing that I would sort of say for all of you in the audience is you should keep a very large toolbox between simple drawings, crude models, sophisticated models, images generated by AI. Don't fall in love with any particular methodology, because you will then become a slave to that methodology. And shifting media is humbling because it keeps us a little bit off balance, and that I think is extremely important. And that goes back to engaging innovative, brilliant collaborators. They'll always come back to you, including students, and say, why are you doing it this way? So I think we're embracing, we're jumping into the water of AI in ways that we never thought possible even 6 months ago. And I'll just follow one humbling story, which I don't know if you know, Professor Hinton is the founder of AI. When we did the early models of the Schwarz-Reisman project, we brought this simple model thinking very humbly, here we are with one of the kind of geniuses of AI, and all of a sudden these brilliant professors who had been at the forefront got around this little humble model and were completely joyful. That was an epiphany. So don't, I think for us, we don't try to rely only on one set of tools.
Yeah, hi. I think most of the project that, well, I think all of the project presented today was like very beautiful. I'm really like drawn toward the sketches and then the structural part of it, and then the integration of like all of the stakeholders in like designing a piece of architecture. But I am most particularly interested in like the La Brea tar pit proposal, because when I was in UC Berkeley doing my undergraduate degree, we actually had like a field trip over there. And then it is a very culturally and a historically interesting site, because there's like LACMA over there by Rezzo Piano. And then there was like addition to that by Peter Zumthor, but that's not really good. But and also yeah, it has been receiving a lot of backlashes lately. And then there's like an automobile museum right next to it, and then there's like a new natural history museum. When we were visiting, there was like still under constructions. And then like what you guys have presented, there's like just like a museum in itself for La Brea. So I guess less than asking a question by like how you as a studio coordinate between like technical roles of urban planners, landscape architects, structural engineers, I just want to ask like if there's any like pillars or key ideas that you would suggest when like dealing with a site that's so interesting and surrounded with like all of these like fabulous works.
You know, that's such a great question. I mean, for us, the more complicated, the more contradictory, the harder, the more impossible it is, the more fun it is to kind of dig in and do research. And I think the question is, when the pillar would be actually do broad panoramic research, then do deep research, and then mess around. Because when you mess around with models and drawings and test driving things, even AI, what you start to see are patterns. And what you saw was that triple loop came from just, it's this part over here is where they do this weird fictional stuff with these strange animals. And this part here is kind of where people gather. And then this part here is where they're doing all their digging. And it was weirdly, a bubble diagram that inspired the triple loop that drew into focus these three distinct areas that then allowed us to then start to think about how to incorporate that very earth that had been the source of wonder, not to mention oil in LA, but the source of wonder of the science that's hidden. And so part of it is the everything all at once would be the pillar of research and discovery and making and testing that you all do in school here already. Carry that forward.
Thank you guys so much for speaking. I mean, your works of architecture are truly poetic, and it's been wonderful hearing from you. I was thinking about how you were talking about how you've worked with engineers and landscape architects, and I was curious to hear whether or not you collaborate with masters within the field, for example, nanotechnicians, botanists, paleontologists. Is that a part of your design process at all?
So on La Brea, actually, we had paleobotanists, botanists who, so that's not a typical collaborator. In Seattle, we had the benefit of two juvenile salmon specialists who both disagreed on what juvenile salmon should like. As Marion said, the weirder the project, the happier we are to collaborate with consultants who typically you wouldn't think of collaborating on. But we've also, I think, we've worked consistently with some consultants, some structural engineers like Jay Taylor at MKA, who are playful and they know how to play with us, they know how to push us, they know how to disagree. And I think there's also an argument to be made for working with the kinds of people that push you in productive ways. So we have some mechanical, some civil engineers, and some landscape architects. And we do have landscape architects in our office with landscape training. We also have some folks who come out of with structural degrees. So we try to keep that kind of broad mix of folks, both specific to the office, but also who we work with.
Yeah, I think your point about these other specialists that get outside of disciplinary terrains, they become very interesting because the bottom line is they go deep and narrow in their field, and we can find ourselves very humble at their feet, trying to learn at the rate of a child the very things they know, so we can host that expertise somehow within the architecture that we're working on.
So I find that in many of your work, in your works, that you blur boundaries between areas and regions and parts of your sites. So I'm wondering if you ever find that you have to use a hard edge to separate things, or if not, then how, for what reasons do you find that your process of blurring these boundaries is so successful in your work, and why do you keep doing it?
I'll just, you saw the Toronto project. We couldn't move an inch off the property line. And in fact, we had to cant the building in to keep the shadows from our building from landing on the legislature lawn. So that meant the hardest boundaries in the world. So the only things that become unbounded there were the movement connections to the city and the community inside. So that blurring, in a sense, is sometimes almost suggesting fuzzy. And I think that we're interested in a kind of purposeful, if you will, transcending of the boundaries, rather than blurring, to be able to achieve something that might not have been possible without letting them go as boundaries.
Yeah, we love the metaphor of blurring, but I think also, as Marion said, it enters into the danger of equivocation. And there are times when you need to have an overtly architectural edge. There are times when you need, through maybe the alignment of trees, to provide an edge that's made through vegetal means. And that kind of definition allows you to blur conceptually, but not necessarily literally. Suits.